Hey guys, welcome aboard to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're going all the way back to ancient Rome, and not the marble column, toga party, gladiator screaming part of Rome that gets all the attention. No, tonight we're visiting a different corner of the empire, a quieter corner, a more perfumed corner. We're talking about Roman prostitutes, the women and men who kept the oldest profession alive and kicking in the most powerful city on earth, somewhere between the year 1 and the fall of everything nice. Now before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. It genuinely means the world to me, and if you've been requesting this topic, leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I promise it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and whoever you are, I am very glad you're here. Now, dim those lights. Put a fan on if you've got one. Let that soft white noise fill the room. Tuck your feet under the blanket because we're about to go somewhere warm, crowded, and very, very ancient. But first, let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a prostitute in ancient Rome? Was it glamorous? Was it miserable? Did you get to pick your clients? Or did the empire just sort of assign them to you like a bad HR department? What did you eat? Did you have a morning routine? Did you look in a bronze mirror and think, well, here we go again? Did you have feelings about Julius Caesar? Strong opinions about the price of wine? A cat? Could you own property? Could you vote? Could you be insulted in public and actually do something about it? What happened when you got old? What happened when you got sick? What did you wear, and who helped you put it on? And how long did all of that take, and was any of it worth it? These are the questions that kept historians up at night, and now they're going to keep you company while you drift gently off to sleep. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Rome. The city is loud, it smells like you would rather not know, and somewhere down the street a man is arguing about fish sauce at full volume. You're a meretrix, a Roman prostitute, and your day has already started without your permission. Welcome to the ancient world. Try not to breathe too deeply. Let's start at the beginning, which in Rome means starting with Latin. Because in ancient Rome, what you were called mattered enormously. Not for your feelings. Rome was not particularly interested in your feelings. But for legal purposes, for tax purposes, for the all-important question of which laws applied to you and which laws you had simply never been allowed near in the first place. The word meretrix comes from the Latin verb merere, meaning to earn. You were officially and legally a woman who earns, which sounds almost dignified until you realise the Roman state used that precise definition to decide how to register you, tax you, and mark you out from the women whose respectability they considered worth protecting. You were not one of those women. You knew it. The entire city knew it. The state had made sure of that. But Latin had more than one word for you, and the variety is itself a kind of portrait of how Rome thought about the whole enterprise. There was the scortum from the word for hide or skin, which was blunt in the way that Romans often were blunt when they felt no particular obligation to be otherwise. There was the lupa, the she-wolf, which carried a specific charge of aggression, of predatory behaviour, as though you were the dangerous one in this arrangement. There was the prostibula, derived from the verb prostere, to stand in front of, a reference to the practice of standing in a doorway or under an archway to signal your availability. And there was the meretrix, the word that the law preferred, because it was the most transactional, the most classifiable, the most useful for official record-keeping. Rome was, above all things, a city that liked to classify. It had categories for everything: citizens and non-citizens, freeborn and freed and enslaved, senatorial class and equestrian class, and everyone else arranged below in a descending order of official concern. You fit into your category the way everything in Rome fit into its category, which is to say with a kind of grinding inevitability that had very little to do with who you actually were as a person, and everything to do with what you did for money and who owned you, if anyone did. The category of meretrix came with what the Romans called infamia. This is the word that mattered most in practical terms. Infamia was not simply a bad reputation in the social sense, the way your neighbour might think less of you. It was a legal designation, a formal marking. It meant that certain protections and certain civic rights simply did not apply to you. You could not bring certain lawsuits. You could not hold certain offices. You could not marry a freeborn Roman citizen of good standing, not legally, not without significant social and legal consequence for the man involved. You were, in the eyes of Roman law, a person who had placed herself outside the circle of full civic humanity, which is a heavy thing to carry around for the rest of your life, particularly when you did not always choose to be placed there in the first place. And yet, you were not invisible, you were not unacknowledged. Rome knew you were there. Rome taxed you. Rome wrote your name down. Rome built specific places for you to work and specific laws to govern how you worked. In a strange and deeply Roman way, the state's obsessive need to categorize you was also a form of recognition. You existed. You were counted. You were, in the cold, bureaucratic language of the empire, officially real. That is not nothing. In a city of 1 million people, being officially real was more than many could say. Rome was nothing if not organized about the things it disapproved of. Prostitution was not illegal in ancient Rome. It was licensed, regulated, taxed. If you practiced the trade in the city, you were required to register with the aediles, the city officials responsible for public order and the maintenance of urban life. You would give your name, your place of work, and the price you charged. These details went into an official record. In exchange, you received something called a licentia, a license that permitted you to operate legally. The moment your name was written down in that book, something changed. Not your life, exactly, not your circumstances, but your legal identity. You had crossed a line that Roman law considered permanent and one-directional. There was no unregistering. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Even if you stopped, even if you married, even if you found work doing something else entirely and never set foot in a lupanar again for the rest of your natural life, the record remained. The Romans did not have an erasure procedure for this particular category. Jurists of the classical period debated the fine points endlessly, as Roman jurists tended to do, but the general consensus was that once a woman had registered as a meretrix and accepted money for her time, the legal status of infamia attached to her permanently. It was not a condition you could recover from. It was a condition you had entered. The registration process itself was a mundane and rather humiliating affair, as most bureaucratic processes involving the state's judgment of your life choices tend to be. You appeared before the relevant official or his representative. You gave your name, which the Romans recorded, and here is a detail that historians have found genuinely interesting, often alongside a professional name, a nomen ludicrum, a working name chosen or assigned to distinguish you in the official register from the name your family had given you. The records at Pompeii preserve a handful of these, names from mythology, from flowers, from abstract qualities, fortunata, restituta, names that meant something like lucky or restored, which is either poignant or bitterly ironic depending on your mood and your generosity of spirit. You also declared your price. This was not optional. The price became a matter of public record. It was the number that appeared, in some form, at your place of work, visible to clients, known to the state, fixed in a way that made the economic logic of your existence completely legible to anyone who cared to look. It is a strange kind of transparency, to have the terms of your most private transactions posted on a wall for the empire to see. But Rome was comfortable with that kind of transparency. The discomfort was yours to manage. The aediles who oversaw this system were also responsible for regulating the markets, the public games, the temples, and the general infrastructure of Roman urban life. You were, in their administrative framework, a feature of the city roughly equivalent to a market stall or a public fountain, something to be maintained, regulated, and taxed, not something to be protected. The revenue from the tax on prostitution flowed into the city's finances alongside the revenue from everything else, indifferent to its origins, perfectly Roman in its practicality. Once registered, you were part of the system. The system in turn was largely indifferent to how that felt, which is not so different, when you think about it, from most systems most people have ever had to navigate. The paperwork is always more interested in the category than in the person inside it. In Rome, clothing was not fashion. Clothing was announcement. A senator wore a toga with a broad purple stripe. A soldier wore his military cloak. A respectable married woman, a matrona, wore a long robe called a stola over her tunic, and when she went out she draped herself in a palla, a modest outer wrap that said, clearly and without ambiguity, that she was under her husband's protection and not to be approached carelessly. You did not wear any of that. Roman law and social custom required registered prostitutes to wear a toga, the garment traditionally associated with men. It was not a kindness, it was a removal. By dressing you in the toga, the state was marking you as outside the category of womanhood it considered worth protecting. Think about what that meant in practice. Every time you stepped outside, every time you moved through the streets of Rome, you were wearing a garment that announced your legal status to everyone who passed. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of blending into the ordinary fabric of the city's female population. No morning where you could walk to the market or the public fountain and simply be a woman going about her day. The toga said what you were before you'd said a single word. It was, in the truest sense, a uniform. And like all uniforms imposed rather than chosen, it was less about what it covered and more about what it declared. The Roman toga itself was a deeply impractical garment. It was a large, roughly semicircular piece of woolen cloth that required significant effort to drape correctly, that tended to slide off the shoulder at inconvenient moments, and that was warm in summer, heavy in rain, and challenging to walk in quickly under any circumstances. The Romans who wore it voluntarily, that is, the male citizens who wore it for official occasions, largely stopped wearing it for everyday life as the empire matured, finding it too cumbersome for ordinary movement through a busy city. You were being required to wear a garment that freeborn Roman men themselves had largely abandoned as impractical. The symbolism there is either very complicated or very simple, and Rome probably did not feel the need to explain it. The colour of the toga you were expected to wear was likely dark. Some ancient sources suggest a toga of dark wool or a toga that had been left undyed, distinguishing it from the bright white toga of the citizen going about his civic duties. The visual contrast between the white of respectable male civic life and the darker, heavier toga of the meretrics in the street was a contrast the city was designed to produce and maintain. Rome was very good at producing and maintaining visual contrasts that communicated social hierarchy at a glance. There were women who got around this requirement, particularly those who operated at the higher end of the trade and who had wealthy, connected patrons willing to look the other way. In a city where legal requirements and daily practice existed in a permanent state of negotiation, the toga rule was probably more consistently enforced in some neighbourhoods and among some populations than others. But for the average woman registered with the aediles, working in an ordinary lupanar on an ordinary street, the toga was the daily uniform. It was what you put on in the morning when you put yourself together for the day. It was what you wore when you walked out into the noise and heat and smell of Rome. It was what the city had decided you should look like, and so it was what you looked like. What you thought about it while you adjusted the drape in the early morning light is something the historical record does not preserve, but you probably had a thought or two. Let's talk about where you actually worked. The word lupanar comes from lupa, the Latin for she-wolf, which was a slang term for a prostitute that Romans used with all the casual cruelty of people who had never stopped to wonder how it sounded to the person being called it. A lupanar was a dedicated brothel, and the most famous surviving example in the entire ancient world sits in Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash since the year 79, as if the mountain had frozen it deliberately for archaeologists to find almost 2,000 years later. It is a small 2-story building near the Forum, narrow, slightly damp one imagines, with small stone rooms along the corridors and built-in stone platforms serving as beds. You walk to work the way anyone walks to work, which is to say with whatever combination of resignation and routine the morning permitted. The streets of Roman Pompeii, and Rome itself scaled up enormously, were not quiet places. They were loud and crowded and smelled of things best not catalogued before breakfast. Stepping stones crossed the streets at intervals because the streets themselves functioned as an open drainage channel for everything the city produced in the course of a day, and while Rome had a genuinely impressive sewer system by ancient standards, the gap between impressive by ancient standards and something you would want to walk through remains considerable. The lupanar occupied a corner position in Pompeii, accessible from 2 streets, which was a practical architectural decision. Multiple entry points meant that clients approaching from different directions could enter without necessarily being seen by everyone on the block. Rome was a city full of people who had opinions about other people's business, and while visiting a brothel was not illegal or especially shocking by Roman standards, most people still preferred a degree of discretion. The building had a ground floor and a second floor, with the ground floor rooms serving as the primary working spaces, and the upper floor possibly housing the workers themselves or accommodating clients willing to pay slightly more for an additional story of privacy. Each room on the ground floor was small, extremely small by the standards of any era. The stone platform that served as a bed was built directly into the wall, a permanent fixture of the architecture rather than a piece of furniture that could be moved or changed. On top of the stone would have been a mattress of straw or wool, a blanket and a pillow if you were fortunate. The ceiling was low. The doorway had a curtain rather than a door, which meant that sound travelled freely and privacy was largely theoretical. This was not an accident of poor planning. It was simply what the space was, and the space was what the budget and the location permitted. The entrance to each room displayed, painted on the wall above the doorway, a price and sometimes a name. To the left as you entered were the rooms, ahead was the corridor. The whole building smelled of lamp oil, of woolen cloth, of the particular closed-air warmth of a space occupied by many people over a long period of time. You knew your room. You knew its dimensions. You could probably have moved through it in the dark, which you sometimes had to do because the oil lamp ran out at inconvenient moments, and replacements cost money. Outside, Pompeii carried on. Bakers were baking. Merchants were selling garum, the beloved fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything, with an enthusiasm that modern visitors to Roman recipes find either baffling or deeply relatable. Children were running. Senators were talking. The mountain sat above the city, perfectly quiet, giving nothing away. One of the more unexpected discoveries in the Pompeii lupanar is what is on the walls. Above the doorways to each small room, painted directly onto the plaster, are frescoes. Not landscapes, not portraits of emperors or scenes from mythology, although Rome had plenty of those elsewhere. These are explicit depictions of sexual acts, painted in the matter-of-fact style of a menu board, which, for all practical purposes, is exactly what they were. Scholars have debated their precise purpose for a long time now. The most practical interpretation is that they served as a visual catalogue, useful in a city where clients and workers might not share a common language. Rome was an empire of many tongues, after all: Greek, Aramaic, various dialects from across Gaul and Hispania and North Africa, all mingled in the streets. The frescoes are painted with a kind of workmanlike directness that is, depending on your perspective, either very clinical or simply very Roman. The figures are represented clearly. The options are presented without ambiguity. There is no particular effort at artistry beyond the competence required to make the images legible. These were not decorative paintings in the sense that the grand frescoes of Pompey's wealthier houses were decorative. They were functional. They were there to do a job, and the job was communication across the language barrier in the fastest possible way. What is also visible on the walls, if you look below the frescoes, is graffiti. The walls of the Pompeii Lupanar are covered in it. Names, prices, opinions, brief reviews that would not have been out of place in a particularly unfiltered corner of the modern internet. The Romans scratched their thoughts onto every available surface with a dedication that modern archaeologists have found alternately illuminating and exhausting. A significant amount of what we know about daily life in Roman Pompeii, what people ate, what they thought about their neighbours, what prices were charged for various goods and services, comes from the graffiti that accumulated on the city's walls over centuries and was then sealed under ash. The names written on the Lupanar walls by clients are names from across the empire. Greek names, Semitic names, Latin names, the names of slaves, identifiable by their form, the names of men who were clearly passing through on business and wanted to leave some record of their visit, in the way that travellers have always wanted to leave some record of their visit, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious and deeply human. Some of the inscriptions are boastful, some are prices noted after the fact, like receipts scratched into stone, some are simple statements of presence. I was here. This happened. I found it worthwhile enough to write down. The women themselves also left marks, or at least marks were left on their behalf, names associated with prices in ways that suggest self-advertisement as much as external notation. Scholars have worked carefully with this evidence, cross-referencing names, prices and locations to construct what partial biographies they can of the women who worked there. These biographies are necessarily fragmentary. They are outlines rather than portraits. But the names survive, which is something. In a world where most people left no record at all, having your name scratched into a wall by a stranger who remembered you is a strange and inadvertent form of immortality. And then the mountain came, and the ash fell, and the frescoes and the graffiti and the stone platforms and the curtain rings and the lamp hooks were all sealed under meters of volcanic material for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for someone to find them and ask carefully what all of it might mean. It means at minimum that ordinary life happened here, in small rooms, in a narrow building, on an unremarkable street in an unremarkable city. Ordinary life of a particular and specific kind, lived by people whose names we sometimes know and whose days we are still, very slowly, learning to understand. Your day started early, not by choice, by the logic of the work itself, which operated largely in the hours when other people's routines left them free and ambulatory and flush with small coins. But before any of that, there was the business of becoming presentable, which in ancient Rome was an undertaking of some considerable effort. You woke, if you were fortunate, on a wooden bed frame strung with rope and topped with a straw or wool-stuffed mattress. The room was small. It was probably dark. The single oil lamp that had burned through the night had likely guttered out some time before dawn, and the smell of its smoke, something between rancid fat and warm wool, hung in the air along with everything else. You lay there for a moment in the particular stillness that Rome only achieved in the hour just before sunrise, when even the street hawkers and the delivery carts had not yet resumed their daily noise. Then Rome started up again, as it always did, without asking anyone's permission. Rome's delivery traffic was restricted to the nighttime hours by law, because the volume of carts required to supply a city of 1 million people would have made the streets impassable during the day. This meant that the hours before dawn were, paradoxically, some of the loudest in the city. wooden cartwheels on stone pavement, the shouts of drivers navigating narrow streets, the complaints of oxen, the crash of amphora being unloaded at a warehouse down the block. Rome at night was not a quiet place. It was just a differently noisy place, and the noise was the particular noise of a city feeding itself. You rose. This required more effort than it sounds, because the Roman bed, even a reasonably good one, was not what we would recognise as comfortable. The rope stringing tended to sag. The mattress, if it was straw, had a way of redistributing itself over the course of the night into precisely the configuration least suited to comfortable rest. Getting up in the morning was a full-body commitment, not a gentle transition. Your feet found the floor, which was stone, and which was cold regardless of the season, because stone floors in small rooms in the ancient Mediterranean are cold in the morning, always, without exception, a fact so consistent across time and climate that it might as well be a law of physics. The room you slept in depended on where you worked, and under what arrangement. If you lived in the lupanar itself, the rooms were the ones we've already described, small, stone-platformed, curtained. If you lived elsewhere and came to work, you had a separate domestic life that the historical record largely does not distinguish from the working one, because Roman sources were not particularly interested in the private sleeping arrangements of meretrices when they were off the clock. Either way, the morning started in a small room with limited light and the sound of Rome warming up outside the walls. You had, in all probability, a chamber pot to deal with before anything else, because Rome, for all its impressive aqueducts and its extraordinary sewage system, had not solved the problem of middle-of-the-night sanitation in private rooms in any way that involved walking down several flights of stairs in the dark. The chamber pot was a fixture of ancient domestic life across all social classes, which is one of those historical facts that levels the playing field in a way that is both equalizing and somewhat unpleasant to contemplate. You dealt with it. You moved on. The morning demanded attention, and Rome was already outside the door announcing itself. No serious meretrix in Rome went to work without her cosmetics, and the cosmetics of ancient Rome were a subject of genuine complexity, moderate danger, and a surprising amount of effort for results that were, by modern standards, somewhat terrifying. White-lead cerussa was the foundation of Roman beauty culture. It was applied to the face and neck to create the fashionable pale complexion that signalled a life lived indoors, away from agricultural labour, away from the sun. The fact that white lead is acutely toxic was not unknown to the Romans, in the vague way that many dangerous things were not unknown while continuing to be enthusiastically used. You smoothed it onto your skin with your fingers, or with a small cloth or sponge, covering everything from hairline to collarbone. The experience of applying white lead paste to your face every morning is not something that history records any sensory detail about, but we can reconstruct it. The paste was cold, it smelled metallic, it sat on the skin with a heaviness that required you to hold your expression somewhat still while it settled, or it would crack at the corners of your eyes and mouth in a way that defeated the entire purpose. Under the warm Roman sun, it needed occasional refreshing throughout the day, because the combination of heat and expression lines worked against it constantly. You were, in effect, engaged in an ongoing battle with your own face. Over the cerussa went colour. Crushed red ochre provided the flush on the cheeks and the stain for the lips, applied with a small tool or a fingertip, rubbed in until it achieved the even tone that fashion required. The eyes were outlined with kohl, a preparation of antimony or soot mixed with some binding agent, plied with a small stick around the lash line to make the eyes appear larger and more defined. Romans considered large, dark-rimmed eyes beautiful. The kohl application required a steady hand and reasonable morning light, both of which were not always available in a small room before sunrise. You did what you could with what you had, which is the beauty routine in every era, stripped down to its essential logic. Your hair required separate attention. Roman women's hairstyles in the imperial period were elaborate constructions involving multiple braids, coils, pins, and sometimes hairpieces made from the hair of enslaved women purchased for exactly that purpose. Whether you maintained a full fashionable coiffure depended on your means and your circumstances. If you had help, a younger woman who assisted in exchange for lodging or food, the more complex styles were achievable. If you were doing everything yourself in a small room with a bronze mirror and limited sleep, a more practical arrangement was probably the order of most mornings. The bronze mirror itself deserves a moment of recognition. Roman mirrors were polished metal, not glass, which meant that the reflection they returned was imprecise by modern standards, slightly warm in tone, slightly blurred at the edges, showing you a version of yourself that was true in the general sense without being entirely accurate in the specific. Getting ready in a bronze mirror is an experience in working from approximation. You could see that the kohl was roughly even. You could see that the colour on your cheeks was roughly balanced. You could not see with any precision whether the small details were quite right. You made your best assessment and went to work. Rome was not going to wait for you to achieve certainty. Food in ancient Rome was, for most people who were not wealthy, a fairly stripped-down affair. The city was fed largely by its grain supply, much of it imported from Egypt and North Africa, and the backbone of the average Roman's daily diet was something called pulse, a thick porridge made from emmer wheat or spelt, boiled in water, eaten plain, or with a bit of olive oil, some salt, maybe a handful of dried vegetables if fortune had smiled recently. If you were doing reasonably well for yourself and lived near the centre of the city, you had access to the thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, which were small storefronts built directly into the street frontage of buildings, with large ceramic jars sunk into stone counters, each containing a different hot preparation. The thermopolia were everywhere in Pompeii. Archaeologists have counted over 80 of them in the excavated city, which suggests that cooking at home was not the primary mode of food acquisition for most Pompeian residents, much as it is not the primary mode for many people in modern cities who live in small apartments without adequate kitchens. The Roman version of this urban reality was that you ate what the nearby counter was selling, which varied by the season and the neighbourhood and the competence of the people doing the cooking. Olives, bread, always bread, a fundamental Roman staple baked in dedicated bakeries whose stone-ground mills and domed ovens have survived in the Pompeii record. Lentil soup, chickpeas, the garum that went on everything, that fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup and soy sauce, and Worcestershire of the ancient world combined into a single pungent preparation that Romans simply could not stop pouring on food. You ate it too, probably. Everyone did. Meat was a luxury item for most of the Roman population. Not impossible, not absent, but not the daily fixture it became in later European cuisine. Sausages were available and popular. The Romans were very good at sausage, which is a sentence that sounds like a joke but is historically accurate. Pork in various preparations, salted, smoked, made into various processed forms, was more accessible to ordinary Romans than whole cuts of fresh meat. Fish, in a city not far from the sea and connected by trade to fishing communities all along the Mediterranean coast, was more available than in many other ancient cities, ranging from affordable common catches to the absurdly expensive specialty fish that wealthy Romans served at dinner parties with the self-satisfied air of people who have spent a significant amount of money on something only to eat it quickly. Your mornings, practically speaking, probably started with bread and olive oil, possibly with a cup of posca, the soldier's drink, a mixture of water and vinegar that sounds deeply unappealing and was, by multiple ancient accounts, actually quite refreshing in the heat, serving roughly the purpose that sports drinks serve now, except at a fraction of the price, and with considerably less sugar. The larger meal of your day would have come in the early afternoon, following the Roman custom of a main meal in the late morning or midday hours rather than the evening. What you could afford and what you actually ate depended, as it always does, on your particular circumstances on any given day. The connection between income and dinner is one of the most consistent facts in all of human history. Rome was not an exception. Money was the entire logic of the arrangement, which makes it somewhat remarkable how little control most meretrices actually had over the price they charged for their time. When you registered with the aediles and received your licentia, you declared a set price. This was not a negotiation. It was a declaration, and once declared, it became a kind of floor, a legally recognised rate below which you technically could not go, though the realities of competition and desperation made the law somewhat theoretical in practice. The prices we know about from ancient sources and from graffiti, scratched into the walls of Pompeii, the ancient world's most enthusiastic scratches of graffiti onto every available surface, ranged quite widely. The going rate for the most basic transaction could be as low as 2 asses, which were small copper coins of quite modest value. To give that some context, a cup of wine at a tavern cost roughly 1 to 2 asses, a loaf of bread cost about 2 asses, so the minimum rate for a meretrix operating at the bottom of the market was approximately equal to a cup of wine or a single loaf of bread. This is not a figure that suggests comfortable prosperity. It is a figure that suggests survival mathematics. How many transactions were required each day to cover food, lodging, the aedile's tax, and whatever portion went to a leno if you were operating within someone else's establishment? The answer, when you work through the arithmetic, is a number that is larger than comfortable and smaller than sustainable in the long term, which describes the economic position of most people at the bottom of most labour markets in most eras of human history. Higher up the market, prices rose significantly. A woman with particular attributes, youth, beauty by Roman standards, skills in conversation or music, a reputation for specific qualities that clients sought, could charge considerably more. Some ancient sources mention prices in the range of several hundred to several thousand sesterces for extended companionship with the most sought-after women at the highest end of the trade. These figures are so far above the 2 asses baseline that they might as well be describing a different profession, which in some ways they were. The range within Roman prostitution was as wide as the range within any other industry structured around desirability and access, which is to say the gap between the least and most fortunate was vast, and the movement between those positions was, for most women, largely in one direction. If a leno owned or controlled your labour, the price structure was more complicated still. He set the price, collected the money, and determined what portion you received. The Roman legal sources are not entirely clear on how these arrangements worked in detail, partly because the legal protections for enslaved workers were non-existent, and the legal protections for free workers who were nonetheless economically dependent were minimal. Some women operated on a kind of commission basis, retaining a portion of what they earned. Others may have lived essentially in a state of debt bondage, with lodging and food and cosmetics and clothing all charged against their earnings in ways that made it structurally impossible to accumulate savings, and the tax. The vectigal, as the Romans called the prostitution tax, was collected by the state with its characteristic thoroughness. The rate and mechanism changed somewhat over the centuries of the empire, but the basic fact was consistent. The state wanted its share, collected it reliably, and put it in the treasury alongside every other source of revenue the empire generated. It was revenue that Rome found useful enough to collect and distasteful enough never to discuss in polite company. The precise combination of hypocrisy that governments across history have found most comfortable when dealing with industries they officially disapprove of and practically depend on. It would be comforting to imagine that the clientele of a Roman lupanar was some exotic subset of the city's population, a niche market, a peculiarity. It was not. Ancient Rome had an enormous prostitution industry by any measure, and it served an enormous and remarkably ordinary cross-section of Roman male society. At the lower end, you had soldiers on leave, slaves with a few coins of their own, and yes, Roman slaves could sometimes earn and hold small amounts of money, dock workers, merchants passing through the city, freedmen trying to feel like something other than what they had recently been. Further up the social scale, though generally at more expensive establishments, you had tradesmen, minor government functionaries, the kind of man who owned a small business and a pair of good sandals, and considered himself solidly respectable in every other department of his life. The Roman attitude toward visiting a brothel was, by the standards of what would come later in Western history, notably matter of fact. Moral philosophy had plenty to say about excess and self-indulgence in general terms, and various Roman writers raised their eyebrows at men who spent too much money or too much time in such establishments. But the basic act was not considered shameful or particularly remarkable for a Roman male citizen. It was something men did. The sources discuss it with the same mild, descriptive tone they used to discuss visiting the baths or attending the games. It was part of the texture of urban life, available, regulated, taxed, and unremarkable. What was remarkable to Romans was excess. The man who bankrupted himself on a high-end courtesan was a figure of social comedy and moral commentary. The man who showed excessive emotional attachment to a meretrix, who behaved, in other words, as though the transactional arrangement was something more, was an object of derision in Roman satirical writing, a fool who had confused commerce for feeling. The emotional danger was considered to run in one direction only, from the foolish man to the calculating woman, which tells you rather a lot about what Romans believed about women in this profession, and rather less than it claims about what was actually happening in those small stone rooms. The experience of the transaction from your side of the curtain was one of the things that Roman sources, written entirely by and for men, did not record. You were the setting, not the narrator. You were the context in which the client's story took place, and so the question of what you thought, what you felt, what you noticed about the person across from you, whether he was nervous or rough or strangely polite, whether he smelled of the docks or the forum or the fuller's yard where cloth was cleaned in fermented urine, was simply not considered worth writing down. But you noticed, you remembered, in the way that anyone who spends their days in close proximity to strangers remembers things, not comprehensively, not sentimentally, but with the particular sharp memory of someone who has to make rapid assessments of people for practical reasons. You knew which clients were worth the trouble and which were not. You knew which ones would argue about the price afterward and which ones were simply tired men who wanted an hour of warmth before going back to whatever their lives were. You developed, over time, the knowledge that comes only from experience, that most people are largely the same in their private needs, and that the ones who think they are exceptional are usually the ones who are most reliably difficult. This is not a lesson unique to ancient Rome. It is simply a lesson taught by the daily work of being human in proximity to other humans that some people learned faster than others, and then they left, and the curtain fell back into place, and you prepared for the next one in the small stone room in the narrow building, while outside the city continued its magnificent indifferent noise. Here is something Rome's legal and social architecture made quite clear. The meretrix herself was the one who bore the social stigma of the profession, but the person who most often controlled her circumstances was someone else entirely. The leno was a male brothel owner or pimp. The lena was his female equivalent. Both words carried profound social disgrace in Roman culture, almost uniquely. The Romans applied infamia, their term for legal and social dishonour, to men who profited from prostitution, as well as to the women themselves. A leno could not serve in the military. He could not hold public office. He could not bring certain legal actions in court. The Romans found the profession morally corrupting in a way that tainted everyone involved, which did not stop an enormous number of people from being very profitably involved in it. The Leno was, by the Roman sources that mention him, not a figure of sympathy. He appears in Roman comedy and satire as a stock villain, greedy, cunning, willing to squeeze every last coin out of the women in his establishment, and every last coin out of the men who came to visit them. The comic playwrights of the Roman stage, particularly Plautus, returned to the Leno repeatedly as a character whose defining quality was a mercenary relationship to human beings, treating people as inventory rather than as people. Whether this characterization was accurate to the full range of actual Lenos operating in actual brothels across the empire, or whether it was a theatrical simplification of a more varied reality, is impossible to say with certainty. Probably both were true simultaneously, as they tend to be. What the Leno provided, practically speaking, was infrastructure. The building, the equipment, the relationship with the aediles that kept the licentia current, the arrangement with the fuller who laundered the bedding, the oil for the lamps, the connection to the food supplier, the system, in other words, the administrative scaffolding that turned a set of small rooms into a functioning commercial establishment. This infrastructure had value. It also had a price, and the price was paid by the women who worked within it, in the form of whatever portion of their earnings the Leno retained, which was not a portion they had significant power to negotiate. The Lena was in some ways a more complicated figure. A woman who had worked in the trade herself and transitioned into managing others occupied a position of unusual ambiguity in Roman social terms. She carried the infamia of her original profession and the additional infamia of profiting from others' labour in this specific way. But she also occupied a position of practical authority that most Roman women did not have access to. She ran a business. She made decisions. She managed people, money, and relationships with the state's regulatory apparatus. Roman law found her distasteful. Roman daily life required her. The tension between those two facts was simply lived with, as most social contradictions are simply lived with, by everyone involved. The relationship between a meretrix and her Leno or Lena was not, in most cases, a warm one. It was a relationship defined by the fundamental inequality of the arrangement, by the fact that one party controlled the space, and the other party provided the labour on terms largely set by the first. Some ancient sources suggest that a Leno might have obligations toward the women in his establishment, that pure brutality was not always the norm, that something like a managed working relationship might sometimes develop. But the power differential was real, it was legal, and it ran consistently in one direction. You worked for him. The building was his. The arrangement continued on his terms until it did not, and when it stopped, the decision was generally his to make. You knew this. You had always known this. You made the calculations that people in constrained circumstances always make, which rules to push against, which to accept, whether small freedoms were located within the larger structure of the arrangement. It is not a heroic situation. It is simply the situation, lived in, navigated, survived. Not every meretrix worked in a lupanar, not by a long stretch. The brothel was one model among several, and for women operating independently, whether by choice or by circumstance, the city itself became the workplace. Street-based prostitution in ancient Rome happened in a variety of locations that the Romans catalogued with their characteristic administrative thoroughness. Under the arches of the circus, in the colonnaded porticos of public buildings, along the streets near the docks and markets where transient male populations congregated, in cemeteries after dark, in the doorways of taverns and inns. The tavern connection was particularly well documented. Many of Rome's corponae, the inns and drinking establishments that dotted every neighbourhood, operated in a grey zone where the serving of wine and the provision of company overlapped in ways that the city's authorities sometimes chose to regulate and sometimes chose to ignore. Working independently meant a different set of freedoms and a different set of dangers. There was no Leno taking a portion of your earnings. There was also no Leno providing the lamp oil, the building, the relationship with the Edile, and the rudimentary protection that operating within a known establishment sometimes afforded. The streets of Rome were not gentle. The city had no organised police force in the modern sense. The vigils, the night watchmen, were primarily concerned with fires and certain categories of property crime, rather than with the personal safety of women in the lower social registers. If something went wrong in the street, or in the doorway of an inn, or under the dark arches of the Circus Maximus after the crowds had gone home, the remedies available to you were limited. And yet the independent life had its logic. You kept what you earned. You set your own hours, within the constraints of where clients were and when they were there. You were not accountable to a Leno's morning inspection, or his accounting of the previous day's income. For a woman with enough experience, enough street knowledge, and enough practical shrewdness to manage the risks, independence was preferable to the alternative. The margins were thinner and the safety net was non-existent, but the freedom was real, and the Romans, despite all their categories and regulations, didn't always enforce the boundaries between these different modes of operation with any great consistency. The tavern world occupied a particularly interesting middle position. A woman who worked as a barmaid, a tabernaria, existed in a legal and social space that the Romans considered adjacent to prostitution, even if it was not identical to it. The mere act of serving wine to strange men in a public house was enough to associate a woman, in Roman social thinking, with sexual availability, whether or not that association was accurate in any given case. The result was that many women who worked in taverns found themselves navigating the assumption of availability without the legal registration that would have formalised it, which was either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the specific circumstances and the specific client or official involved. Roman law characteristically tried to draw lines in this grey area. A woman who served wine could be considered to have implicitly accepted the associated social status. Some jurists argued for narrow definitions that protected certain women from the automatic application of infamia. Others argued for broader definitions. The arguments went back and forth across centuries of legal commentary, which is what Roman legal arguments generally did. And in the meantime, the women involved continued to live their actual lives in the space between the competing theories. Working without walls ultimately meant carrying the workplace with you. The building, the lamp, the curtained doorway, these were replaced by judgment, movement, and the accumulated knowledge of which corners of the city were productive at which hours and which were simply cold and empty and pointless. It was a harder education than most, and you paid the full cost of acquiring it yourself. As with almost everything in the ancient world, money changed the texture of the experience entirely. At the very top of the Roman sex trade were women who occupied a social position so distinct from the average meretrics that the comparison requires some careful handling. These were the delicatae, or in Greek terminology the heterai, educated, cultivated companions who attached themselves to wealthy and powerful men, sometimes for extended periods, in arrangements that blurred the lines between concubinage, patronage, and something that might, in more generous vocabulary, be called a relationship. These women were not operating out of stone rooms in a side street lupanar. They lived in proper apartments or houses. They attended dinner parties. They were expected to be able to converse intelligently on philosophy, politics, literature and art, because the men who sought their company were men for whom intelligent conversation was part of what they were paying for. The education required to function at this level was not accidental. It was acquired deliberately, either because a young woman had been trained from an early age for this specific position, a practice that certainly occurred, particularly among certain categories of enslaved women purchased and educated for the purpose, or because she had managed to educate herself through access to books, to conversation with educated men, and to the kind of self-directed intellectual development that the ancient world made extremely difficult for women of any class, but not entirely impossible for those with both the intelligence and the opportunity to pursue it. Wealthy Roman men took pride in their cultivated companions in a way that was publicly acknowledged, even as it was socially complex. The philosopher and the politician both understood that a woman who could hold her own in a discussion of Stoic ethics, or critique the latest work of a contemporary poet, added something to their social life that a purely transactional encounter did not provide. This was not a secret or an embarrassment. It was practically a category in Roman social life, the educated companion, distinguished from the wife by her legal status and from the ordinary meretrix by her accomplishments. The wife managed the household. The delicata managed the conversation at the party that the wife did not attend. The money at this level was real and sometimes substantial. A woman in this position might accumulate significant personal wealth over the course of a career, jewellery, property, savings. Some ancient sources describe women in this position owning their own homes in good neighbourhoods, maintaining their own enslaved household staff, lending money at interest. These were not common outcomes. They were exceptional ones, the result of a specific combination of beauty, intelligence, business acumen, and favourable circumstances that most women in the trade did not have and could not acquire. But they existed, and the Romans wrote about them, which tells us that the possibility was legible to the culture even if it was rare in practice. The irony is that infamia attached to these women just as it attached to the woman charging 2 asses in the Pompeii alleyway. The legal marking did not scale with the price. A courtesan who owned 3 properties and could quote Cicero from memory was, in Roman law, in the same category of civic dishonour as the most vulnerable woman at the bottom of the market. Rome's categories were not interested in nuance of this kind. You had registered, you had accepted money. The law had its box for you, and it placed you in it regardless of how interesting your dinner conversation was, or how impressive your property portfolio had become. What the money bought practically was everything except the legal category. And within the walls of your own house, in the company of people who valued what you actually were, the legal category was sometimes, on the better days, possible to set aside. Roman law was a sophisticated and sprawling body of doctrine that covered an astonishing range of human activity, and it had quite a lot to say about the meretrix. Very little of it was in her favour, but it was thorough. Once you registered and received your licentia, you acquired the legal status of infamia, literally, without good reputation. This designation had concrete practical consequences that reached into every corner of civic life. You could not marry a Roman citizen of good standing, not practically, not legally. The laws governing Roman marriage, which were themselves a complex negotiation between custom, family honour, and the state's interest in legitimate inheritance, simply excluded you. A freeborn Roman man who married a registered prostitute lost social standing, and potentially legal standing as well. Augustus, the first emperor, had formalized many of these restrictions in his marriage legislation, the Lex Julia de Adulteris, and related laws passed in the final decades before the Common Era and the early years of the Empire. These laws were ostensibly designed to protect the institution of marriage, to encourage legitimate childbearing among the Roman citizen class, and to draw clear legal lines around the categories of women that respectable men could and could not marry. Women of infamia were explicitly placed in the cannot column. What Augustus did not appear to notice, or chose not to notice, was the profound contradiction involved in passing marriage protection legislation while himself conducting what most of his contemporaries understood to be a series of relationships with women that were not his wife. Roman history is, in this as in so many things, a document of remarkable human consistency. The protections that Roman law afforded to ordinary freeborn women, limited by modern standards, but real, also operated differently for you. If a Roman matron was assaulted in the street, Roman law had concepts, however imperfectly enforced, of injury and remedy. The legal notion of inuria, wrongful harm, applied to her bodily integrity. For a woman of infamia, the application of these protections was legally complicated. Some jurists argued that inuria could still apply. Others argued that a woman who had placed herself in a public commercial context had implicitly accepted certain risks of that context. The debate continued in the law schools and the legal commentaries for centuries, because Roman law loved nothing more than an argument it could sustain indefinitely, while in the streets the practical outcome of the argument was lived by actual people in real time. What you could do under Roman law was not nothing. If you were a freeborn woman, not enslaved, you had legal personhood. You could own property, you could enter contracts, you could bring lawsuits in certain circumstances, though the categories of litigation available to you were narrowed by your status. You could conduct business, you could buy and sell. The Roman legal system, for all its explicit disadvantaging of women in this profession, maintained the basic apparatus of legal personality that distinguished a free person, even a deeply stigmatized one, from a slave. The gap between legal theory and daily reality was, as always, large. Knowing that you technically had the right to bring a property dispute before a magistrate did not make it easy, or likely or affordable to do so. Roman courts required time, money, and social connections that the average meretrix did not possess in abundance. The law's protections were most useful to those who had the resources to invoke them, which is not a feature unique to Roman law, but is perhaps one of its most reliably documented qualities. You lived inside this legal framework the way most people live inside the legal frameworks of their time, aware of it in a general sense, occasionally affected by it in specific ways, and mostly occupied with the immediate practical concerns of the day, which the law addressed imperfectly and sporadically at best. A significant portion of the women working in Roman brothels were slaves, and this distinction matters enormously, not because it changes the basic circumstances of the work, but because it removed even the residual agency that a free woman, however constrained, technically possessed. Slavery in Rome was an institution of staggering scale. At the height of the empire, slaves may have constituted a third of the population of Italy. They came from everywhere, from conquest, from piracy, from the children of enslaved parents, from debt, from the edges of the empire where Roman military expansion met civilian populations with no political protection. A slave woman who was sold to a Leno had no recourse. She could not refuse. She could not register a complaint. She could not choose her clients, her hours, her location, or her price. Roman law acknowledged, at least in theory, a small number of protections for enslaved people, even within this fundamentally brutal institution. There were provisions, not consistently enforced, against masters killing their slaves without cause. There were certain circumstances under which a slave could seek protection at a temple, or the statue of the emperor, a practice called asylum, which provided a limited procedural protection, a brief pause in the owner's authority while the situation was reviewed. In practice, the reviewing authority was not operating from a position of structural sympathy toward the enslaved person, and the outcomes of these appeals were, by any honest accounting, not reliably favourable. What an enslaved meretrix could accumulate was almost entirely social rather than material: relationships, knowledge, reputation. Within the social world of the lupanar, she might develop connections with other women that provided genuine mutual support. the kind of practical solidarity that emerges in any situation where people share constrained circumstances over time and understand that collective navigation is more survivable than isolated endurance. She might develop a reputation with clients that gave her some small degree of protection. The client who preferred her specifically was at least a client who had a reason to return and a corresponding reason not to damage the thing he wanted to find when he did. The path out of slavery, manumission, was real, but neither guaranteed nor swift. A master could free an enslaved person voluntarily, and many did, for various reasons ranging from genuine affection to the purely economic logic of freeing an older worker no longer productive enough to justify the cost of maintenance. An enslaved woman who managed to accumulate a peculium, that small informally held personal fund that some masters permitted, might eventually purchase her own freedom if the sum was agreed upon and the master honoured the arrangement. This happened. The freed women of Rome were a significant population, many of them formerly enslaved in commercial and domestic contexts, and some of them had histories that passed through exactly the circumstances we're describing. But the path was long and uncertain, contingent on the goodwill and changing circumstances of an owner whose priorities had nothing to do with hers, and the years spent on that path were years lived inside the institution without the protections that legal freedom, however limited, would have provided. You did what was required of you. You learned what you needed to learn to survive the day. You held whatever small private things you could hold, a memory, a friendship, a plan, a hope kept quiet because hope announced too loudly has a way of being taken from you along with everything else. Rome was very good at taking things. You learned to keep the important ones somewhere it could not easily reach. This is, in many ways, the most practically interesting question of her entire life, and the answer is nuanced in the way that ancient Roman answers tended to be nuanced, which is to say, it depended enormously on who you were, who owned you, if anyone, and how much you had managed to accumulate before someone more powerful than you decided to take an interest. A slave had no legal capacity to own property. Whatever she earned went to her owner, full stop, with the possible exception of a peculium, a small sum that a master might permit a slave to hold and manage as a kind of informal personal fund, revocable at any time. A free woman, even one marked with infamia, retained basic legal capacity to hold property. She could, in theory, own the contents of her room, her cosmetics, her clothing, her jewellery. In practice, the accumulation of meaningful savings required the combination of sufficient income, sufficient control over that income, and sufficient protection from the various forces that reliably stripped money away from people without institutional power. The Leno took his portion. The Aediles tax took another. Food and lodging and cosmetics and lamp oil took more. The replacement of worn-out clothing, and clothing in the ancient world wore out faster than modern people accustomed to machine-manufactured fabrics tend to intuitively appreciate, took more still. What was left, after all of that, depended on the volume of business and the terms of the arrangement, and for many women it was not much. Jewellery was a favoured form of savings throughout the ancient world, and this was not mere vanity. Small items of gold or silver could be worn on the body, transported without difficulty, converted back into coin, or traded for goods in any city in the empire. A woman who had accumulated a few rings, a bracelet, a pair of earrings, had accumulated portable, concealable, liquid wealth in a form that was significantly harder to confiscate than coin kept in a box in a room that belonged to someone else. Roman women across all social classes understood this logic and practiced it. The meretrix who wore her savings on her fingers and wrists was doing exactly what a Roman noblewoman did, for exactly the same reason, with significantly less margin for error if something went wrong. Some women managed to accumulate more. The historical record preserves a handful of examples of meretrices who became genuinely wealthy by the standards of their time, who owned property, who made loans, who left wills disposing of real estates. These are exceptional cases, documented precisely because they were exceptional, the way that any outcome sufficiently improbable tends to attract attention and get written down. They should not be read as representative of typical outcomes. They should be read as evidence that the outcome was possible, which is a different and more limited claim. The typical outcome was financial precarity sustained over time through continuous labour, with the margin between adequate and inadequate fluctuating in response to age, health, competition, and the general economic conditions of the city, none of which were within any individual woman's control. You managed what you could manage, you saved what you could save, in whatever form offered the best combination of security and accessibility. You watched the small stack of coins or the worn gold bracelet, and understood that it represented the gap between a bad month being a difficult month and a bad month being a catastrophic one. This is not a story unique to ancient Rome. It is the story of anyone who has ever worked in a precarious industry with limited institutional protection and watched the distance between their actual circumstances and the circumstances they needed carefully, anxiously, every single day. Rome ran on festivals. The Roman religious calendar was, by any reasonable accounting, extremely full. There were festivals for agricultural seasons, festivals for military victories, festivals for gods of various specific and sometimes quite narrow portfolios. Festivals that had been running so long nobody was entirely certain what they were originally for. Several of these festivals created conditions in which the ordinary rules of Roman social life loosened, and for women whose lives were defined by rigid legal and social constraints, even a loosening was significant. The Floralia was one such festival. Celebrated in late April and early May in honour of Flora, the goddess of flowers and of the flowering of plants, it was known for being particularly uninhibited. Ancient sources, most of them written by men who are simultaneously disapproving and extremely detailed in their descriptions, tell us that the Floralia was associated with performances that were more explicit than was usual even for Rome's generally relaxed theatrical standards. There were mime performances. There were games in the circus with an unusually festive atmosphere. And there were, according to the sources, performances by meretrices themselves, who appeared on stage in contexts that the standard Roman theatrical codes would not normally have permitted. The festival, in other words, created a brief authorized exception to certain rules about public display, and the women most associated with that exception were the women whose legal status had already placed them outside the normal boundaries. What this meant for the individual woman navigating the Floralia season is not something the historical record captures in any intimate detail. What it probably meant was a period of increased business, increased visibility, and, at least for some women, a period in which the normal social invisibility of their existence was temporarily replaced by something closer to public acknowledgement. Not respect, precisely. Roman society did not arrive at respect for this profession during the Floralia or at any other point, but acknowledgement, recognition that these women existed, that they had a role in the city's life, that the festival had a place for them. It was a thin and qualified form of recognition, but Rome was not generous with recognition of any kind toward women in this position, and thin and qualified is what there was. The Saturnalia, held in December, was another period of license, the famous Roman festival during which social hierarchies were ceremonially inverted, masters served their enslaved workers, gambling was permitted openly in public, and the general tone of the city shifted toward a festive suspension of normal order. The Saturnalia was primarily about the inversion of the master-slave relationship and the release of social tensions built up over the rest of the year, and its effects on the daily life of a meretrix were probably less dramatic than its effects on the enslaved population generally. But any period of general license in the city's social atmosphere changed the texture of movement through it, changed which rules were being actively enforced and which were being quietly overlooked, and created a temporary shift in the background conditions of daily life. Festivals were also simply days when the city was alive in a particular way, when the streets were fuller, the noise was louder, the smell of roasting meat and burning incense and fresh flowers filled the air, and the normal grinding rhythm of ordinary days was replaced by something that felt, at least briefly, like it might be celebration, even at the margins of the celebration, even standing under the arches watching the procession rather than walking in it. Even then, the city was doing something other than its usual thing, and that was, on balance, preferable. Ancient Rome was not a healthy city. This requires no elaborate explanation. The combination of dense urban population, inadequate sanitation, and medical knowledge that was sophisticated in theory and extremely limited in practice produced a disease environment of sustained and democratic misery. Everyone got sick. The emperor got sick. The senators got sick. The Vestal virgins got sick. And if you were a meretrix living in a small room off a damp corridor near the docks, you got sick with particular frequency and with fewer resources to address it. The Romans knew a great deal about symptoms and rather less about causes, at least in the modern epidemiological sense. They understood contagion in a loose way, that certain diseases spread between people in close proximity, but the mechanisms were understood through a framework of miasma and imbalance rather than pathogens. Roman medicine, following the Greek tradition it inherited and elaborated, operated on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was the proper balance of these four substances within the body. Disease was an imbalance, caused by diet, environment, climate, emotional states, or divine disfavour depending on which element of Roman medical and religious thinking you were consulting at any given moment. The treatments available followed this logic: bleeding, to reduce an excess of blood; purgatives, to expel whatever had accumulated in harmful quantities; dietary changes, to correct the imbalances that food and drink could produce; rest, warmth, and specific herbal preparations that were, in some cases, genuinely effective, and in others, simply pleasant-smelling ways of doing nothing medically useful. Physicians in Rome were a mixed and stratified group. At the top were Greek-trained doctors who served wealthy households and charged accordingly, men with real theoretical education and some accumulation of practical experience who were capable of performing procedures like reducing dislocations and treating infected wounds with reasonable competence. At the other end of the spectrum were people who sold remedies in the street, with approximately the medical authority of whoever happened to be standing next to them at the time. The range between these extremes was enormous, and the consumer had very limited means of evaluating where on the spectrum any particular practitioner fell. If you fell seriously ill, your options were largely determined by your economic position and your social connections. A physician could be consulted if you had the money and the access. Temple medicine, consulting the god Asclepius at his sanctuary, sleeping in the precincts in hopes of a healing dream, was available to anyone who could get to the temple, and the sanctuary on the Tiber Island in Rome was specifically associated with treating the sick poor. There was genuine care available there, of a kind that blended religious practice with herbal treatment and the genuine healing power of rest, warmth, and regular feeding. For a woman with no family, no protector, and a Leno whose interest in her well-being extended precisely as far as her ability to continue working, the temple sanctuary was sometimes the most reliable option available. What happened to you if you became too ill to work for an extended period depended bleakly on the specific arrangements that governed your situation. In the best case, you recovered. In a less good case, you recovered but at a diminished capacity that affected your earning potential going forward. In the worst case, and the worst case arrived with great irregularity in a city where clean water was not reliably clean, and infectious disease was a structural feature of urban life rather than an exception, it was simply the end. Rome moved on. The city was extremely good at moving on. It had had a great deal of practice. This is the part that histories tend to skip. The drama of registration, the commerce of the transaction, the legal architecture of her status, these things left records. But the long quiet hours between, those barely made it into the texts. So we reconstruct them from fragments, from graffiti, from objects found in the rooms of Pompeii, from the offhand remarks of Roman writers who mentioned daily life in passing without realizing they were preserving it. She spun wool, probably. Textile work was so deeply embedded in Roman female life that even women far removed from the domestic ideal of the spinning matrona tended to continue it. It was something to do with your hands. It produced something tangible and saleable. It was quieting in the same way that repetitive handwork has always been quieting, the fingers finding their rhythm while the mind went somewhere else entirely. The objects found in the rooms of Pompeii and in contexts associated with Roman brothels and their inhabitants include items that speak to ordinary domestic life with a directness that the written sources rarely achieve. Small gaming pieces, bone dice, counters made from pottery sherds, oil lamps, sometimes in shapes that suggest a practical sense of humour about the work they illuminated, perfume flasks of various sizes, some modest and some more ambitious, suggesting a range of spending on scent that tracked with the range of circumstances in the trade. Small figurines, some religious and some simply decorative, of the kind that people place in rooms to make rooms feel like something other than just rooms. A terracotta statuette of a seated woman, a small bronze ring, a broken comb. These objects are not evidence of suffering, and they are not evidence of happiness. They are evidence of someone living in a space, making it habitable in the small ways that people make spaces habitable, and spending the hours that were not otherwise claimed in the ways that people spend hours, with handwork, with games, with the small decorative gestures of domesticity, with the objects that connect the private interior life to something beyond the immediate transactions of the day. Music was part of a life in Rome at every social level. The tibia, a kind of double flute, was played by women in both sacred and secular contexts throughout Roman society. A woman with musical ability might play between clients, or in the evenings, or in the company of other women in the building. Roman writers associated musical skill in women with a complex mixture of admiration and suspicion. A cultivated woman who could play was attractive, but a woman who played for money was something the moral commentators felt differently about. For the woman herself, the music was probably simply music, something pleasant, something practiced, something that filled the quiet air of the room with sound that had nothing to do with commerce. Conversation was its own currency in the hours between. Whoever else was in the building, other women, the leaner or her assistant, a younger girl who ran errands, the occasional neighbour who had developed a habit of dropping by, provided the social fabric of the day. These conversations do not survive. They were never written down. But they happened constantly, because people talk to the people they live and work near, and this was true in Rome as it has been true in every human settlement of any size in every period of history. The small news of the neighbourhood, the gossip about clients, the exchange of information about prices and availability, and which streets were safe at which hours. All of this circulated in the oral economy of the building, useful, immediate, and as vanished from the record as smoke. But it was there, The room was not silent. The day was not empty. Between the recorded transactions and the documented legal status, there was a life, lived in the small hours, in the ordinary ways, by an ordinary person navigating extraordinary circumstances. This is perhaps the most important thing to remember about her. Not the toga, not the infamia, not the stone bed. The person, sitting by the window in the warm Roman afternoon, spinning wool, listening to the city, waiting for whatever came next. One of the great gifts of Pompeii is that it preserved not just the architecture and the artwork, but the casual written record of daily life, the scratched and painted words that ordinary people left on walls, on columns, on the exterior surfaces of buildings, on the insides of doorways. Ancient Rome's graffiti is an extraordinary archive of voices that official history tended to ignore. Prices were advertised, transactions were recorded, names appeared with various annotations, some admiring, some brutal, some simply descriptive. Some meretrics left their names on the walls themselves, or had names that clients scratched there afterward in the manner of ancient reviews. Scholars have identified a number of women by name from the Pompeii evidence alone: Fortunata, Maria, Restituta, names that appear with a price and sometimes a brief characterization. The price annotations are themselves a form of data. A name followed by a number tells you something specific. This person worked here. This was the rate. Someone thought it was worth writing down. Whether the person who wrote it was the woman herself advertising her services, a satisfied client recording a transaction, or a competitor posting information for reasons of their own, is not always possible to determine. Probably all three possibilities were true at different moments, in different instances, across the extensive graffiti record that Pompeii's walls preserve. The ambiguity of authorship is itself interesting. It means that the women were visible in the record, their names, their prices, their locations were known and circulated, even if the visibility was mediated through the eyes and hands of others. Some of the graffiti is more personal. There are declarations, brief, sharp, occasionally affectionate, occasionally brutal, that speak to something beyond the purely commercial. A name written with an apparent warmth, a brief phrase that sounds less like a price list and more like someone who had a specific person in mind when they picked up the stylus. Roman men could, and did, develop genuine emotional attachments to women in this profession, attachments that their social world considered foolish and their satirists mocked relentlessly, but that human emotional mechanics produced regardless of what satire thought about the matter. The graffiti sometimes shows the trace of those attachments in a way that the official literary sources, always standing back and commenting, do not. The women themselves left other marks. Personal names scratched not as advertisement but as record. I was here, in this room, in this building, in this city. The impulse to mark your presence is as old as human beings in places, and the walls of Pompeii are its most perfectly preserved ancient expression. A woman who knew she was legally marked with infamia, who walked through a city wearing a garment that announced her legal category to everyone who passed, who had very limited means of asserting her existence in any official or lasting way, picking up a nail and scratching her name into the plaster of a wall was not a trivial act. It was the act of someone who wanted to exist in the record, wanted to be, on some level, undeniable. The ash came and covered all of it impartially. The graffiti of the senators and the graffiti of the meretrices were both sealed under the same mountains in different output, preserved with equal carelessness and equal permanence for the people who would eventually excavate and read them. The volcano did not distinguish. In death and in volcanic preservation, the writing on the walls achieved a kind of equality that life in Roman Pompeii had not provided. What was written is what survived. Names, prices, brief phrases, the record of an ordinary day in an extraordinary city at the moment everything stopped. You were there. The wall remembers. This is the quietest and in many ways the hardest part of the story. Women who worked in the Roman sex trade had children. This is not a subject that ancient sources dwell on at any length, partly because children born to women of infamia were legally and socially complicated, and partly because Roman literature was written by men of the senatorial and equestrian classes who found the domestic circumstances of meretrices neither interesting nor worth examining. But the children existed. A woman born a slave and sold into a brothel who became pregnant, and this happened regularly, despite the various contraceptive methods the Romans employed with varying degrees of success, faced circumstances that were almost entirely outside her control. Roman contraception was a genuine field of ancient knowledge, and not an entirely ineffective one. The physician Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, produced a detailed gynecological text that discussed contraceptive methods with a clinical thoroughness that would not have been out of place in a medical school several centuries later. Wool pessaries soaked in various preparations, dietary interventions, physical methods of various kinds. Some of what Soranus recommended had genuine physiological basis. Some of it operated entirely on the power of wishful thinking. In practice, the combination of inconsistent access to effective methods and the basic mechanics of the situation meant that pregnancy was a recurring feature of life for women in this profession, managed with whatever tools were available and whatever knowledge had circulated through the community of women who had faced the same circumstances before. When a child was born to a slave woman, the child was also a slave, by the absolute logic of Roman inheritance law. The child belonged to the master from the first breath. Whether the child remained with the mother or was sold away, whether it was raised within the household or sent elsewhere, was entirely the master's decision, made on the master's timetable for the master's reasons. The emotional reality of this for the woman involved is not something the Roman legal sources considered relevant to record. It was simply the law. The law moved on. The woman stayed behind with whatever the law had left her. For a free woman of infamia who became pregnant, the situation was legally different but practically almost as constrained. She could keep the child. But the child born to a registered meretrix carried its own complications. The question of the father's identity, which determined the child's legal status. The question of how to care for an infant while continuing the work that paid for both of them. The question of what the child's future looked like when it had been born into a household defined by the profession. The Romans had, running through their city in significant numbers, orphaned and abandoned children, the alumni, as the foundlings were sometimes called, many of them collected from the places where exposed infants were left, the rubbish heaps and the columns and the doorways of temples, and raised in various forms of informal or formal servitude, in households, in workshops, in establishments of the kind we've been describing. Exposure, leaving an unwanted infant in a public place, was legal in Rome and practiced across social classes, not only among the poor. The Romans did not classify it as murder in the way that later legal traditions would. The exposed child might be found and raised by someone who wanted a child, or wanted a future worker or future slave. It might not be found in time. The law was indifferent to which outcome occurred. The mother, in whatever circumstances she had been navigating when she made the decision, was also legally invisible in the outcome, her role beginning and ending with the birth itself. Some children were kept. Some were raised within the buildings where their mothers worked, growing up in the particular world of the lupanar with its stone rooms and its oil lamps and its curtained doorways, learning the codes and the rhythms of that world from the earliest age, inheriting their mother's category by proximity and eventually by formal registration if they did not find another path before that moment arrived. The inheritance of circumstances is one of the most consistent features of human social organization across every era and culture. Rome did not invent it. Rome simply codified it with characteristic thoroughness and moved on to the next item of legal business. What a mother in this position felt about all of it is something the record does not preserve, and something we should not pretend to reconstruct with false precision. What we can say is that she felt it, that the children were real, and the circumstances were real, and the love and the fear and the grief and the stubborn daily management of impossible situations were all real, and they were lived by actual people in actual rooms, in an actual city, and the fact that none of it was written down by anyone who thought it worth preserving does not make it any less true. Roman beauty culture had a great deal to say about aging, almost none of it sympathetic, and the particular calculus of a profession built on physical youth and the appearance of desirability meant that aging was an occupational crisis rather than simply a personal one. Ovid, Horace, and various other Roman poets wrote about the aging prostitute with a tone that managed to be simultaneously pitying and contemptuous, which is a remarkable rhetorical achievement and an extremely unpleasant reading experience. The meretrix who had worked through her 20s and 30s and found herself in her 40s in a city that considered 40-year-old women ancient faced a set of options, none of them particularly comfortable. Some became line, female brothel keepers, transitioning from worker to manager, trading the front room for the accounts and the authority, however brutal, that came with ownership. The transition from meretrix to lina was not inevitable, and it was not available to everyone. It required capital, enough money to take on a lease, to purchase or arrange the housing of other workers, to establish the relationship with the aediles that kept the operation legal. It required connections, knowledge of suppliers, of clients, of the administrative apparatus of the trade. And it required the particular temperament of someone willing to occupy the position of the leno that we described earlier, to sit on the other side of the arrangement that had defined your working life, to be the one setting terms rather than receiving them. Some women made this transition successfully and ran establishments for decades. Others attempted it and failed when the money ran out or the circumstances turned against them. Others did not attempt it at all. For those who did not make the transition to management, the alternative paths were narrower. Domestic service was one. A woman with years of experience navigating the social world of Rome's wealthier households, with skills in cosmetics and dress and conversation, might find work in a large household as an attendant or as someone who managed the presentation of other women in the household, the kind of role that required exactly the practical knowledge she had spent years accumulating. This was not a guaranteed landing. It required the right connection at the right moment, and the right moment had a way of arriving when you were not quite ready or not quite in the right place to take advantage of it. The cerussa, the white lead foundation that had been the basis of the Roman beauty routine, was not kind to faces over time. The chronic low-level lead poisoning that resulted from years of daily application produced effects that aged the skin prematurely and eroded the health of the nervous system in ways that the Romans did not understand mechanistically, but sometimes observed in their general descriptions of women who had worked in the trade for many years. The cosmetics that had been the tool of the profession had a long-term cost that was paid in the currency of the body, quietly, over decades, in ways that compounded the natural aging process with something more systematic and more damaging. Roman medical texts note skin conditions, tooth problems, and a general physical deterioration in women of this profession that they attributed variously to diet, to lifestyle, and to the general moral degeneracy that they believed the profession induced. The moralizing overlay is obvious and tedious. The underlying physical observations were real, even if the causal explanations were wrong. Bodies accumulate the evidence of their circumstances. Years of inadequate nutrition, interrupted sleep, chronic stress, and daily lead application left marks that were legible on the face and the frame and the general condition of a woman in her 40s in a way that was significantly more pronounced than the marks left by 40 years of a more sheltered life. And yet, women aged in this profession and continued. The records preserve women working in the trade at ages that Roman society considered remarkable for anyone, let alone for someone in physically demanding work. The body is stubborn in ways that Roman poets, comfortable in their study chairs with their cups of good wine, consistently underestimated. You adapted. You found the clients who were not looking for what they had been looking for at 20. You found the role that your particular combination of experience, knowledge, and remaining assets supported. You negotiated with whatever the day had actually brought, rather than the day Roman literature had decided you deserved. This is in the end what survival always looks like. Not heroic, not picturesque, just the steady, daily, unglamorous work of continuing, which is its own form of defiance, even when nobody is watching and nobody has decided to write it down. Rome had a complicated mythology around prostitutes that managed to honour them in the abstract and ignore them in the specific, which is a tradition that has proven remarkably durable across the full sweep of Western history right up to this morning's news cycle. Lupa, she-wolf, was a derogatory term, yes, but the she-wolf was also the animal who had suckled Romulus and Remus, the mythological founders of Rome itself. Some ancient sources suggested that the word lupa referred not to an actual wolf but to a prostitute, that the legend of the founding of Rome was, at its origin, a story about a woman of the streets who kept 2 abandoned infants alive. Scholars have debated this interpretation for centuries. Whether or not it is historically accurate, the ambiguity itself is telling. Rome built its founding myth on the image of a nurturing female figure, and then spent the next several centuries treating the women who bore any resemblance to that figure with legal contempt. The festival of the Lupercalia, one of Rome's most ancient and most vigorously observed festivals, was named for the Lupa and celebrated the founding myth of the city with an enthusiasm that included in its early form near-naked young men running through the streets striking people with thongs of goat skin. The connection between this festival and the founding story and the word for a prostitute was something the Romans were aware of and discussed, not always reaching the same conclusions. The mythology was layered and not entirely coherent, as mythologies tend to be, the product of centuries of accumulated stories that had not been designed to fit neatly together, and largely did not. There were also specific religious figures associated with sexuality, and with the women who worked in it. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, was officially the patroness of Rome itself, the divine ancestor of the Julian family and therefore of the emperors. Her relationship to the actual women who earned their living from the commerce of love was, theologically speaking, complicated. She was available as a religious object to women in the trade. The temples of Venus were places where meretrices could and did make offerings, where they sought divine favour for their work, for their health, for the safety of clients who might become dangerous, and the attraction of clients who might become generous. The goddess did not discriminate, at least not in any theologically documented way. The Romans also had a festival called the Vinalia Urbana in late April, which was specifically associated with Venus, and which some ancient sources connect to the women of the trade-making offerings and seeking the goddess's blessing at the beginning of the season. If this connection is accurate and the ancient sources are not entirely consistent on the details, it suggests that there was an officially recognized, ritually structured moment in the Roman religious year when the women of this profession were explicitly included in the city's relationship with its divine patrons, not in the central rituals, not at the Vestal Virgin's fire, but in their own adjacent observance, legitimate in its way, real in its practice, one of the small ritual acknowledgements that the city extended even to its most stigmatized populations, because Rome understood, at some level, that its official discourse did not always articulate that these women were also part of what the city was. The mythology was never going to save you from the infamia. It was never going to restore the legal protections that registration had removed, or give you the standing to challenge the Leno's accounting, or change what the Morning Mirror showed. But it placed you, however obliquely, in the story the city told about itself. The she-wolf at the centre of Rome's founding, the offering at Venus's temple in late April, the small ritual acknowledgements scattered through the religious year like breadcrumbs. It is not justice. It is not even close to justice, but it is presence. And in a world that had decided to officially render you invisible, presence was something worth noting. For many years, historians believed that ancient Rome, and indeed much of the ancient Mediterranean world, practiced what they called sacred prostitution, ritual sexual acts performed in temples as a form of religious worship, with the proceeds going to the temple treasury. The supposed existence of this practice was cited confidently in scholarly literature for a very long time, often in connection with temples dedicated to Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty, or to her Greek equivalent Aphrodite. The evidence, when examined with modern rigour, turns out to be considerably thinner than the tradition suggested. Most of what the ancient sources say about sacred prostitution is either vague, second-hand, or refers to practices in other cultures, Babylon in particular, that may themselves have been misunderstood or exaggerated. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described a practice at the Temple of Melita in Babylon, in which every woman was required to sit in the temple precinct and have intercourse with a stranger before marriage, the proceeds of which went to the goddess. This passage has generated an enormous amount of scholarly debate for centuries, because Herodotus was a writer of considerable charm and variable reliability, and because the practice he described does not appear in Babylonian sources with any clarity. The current scholarly consensus is that Herodotus's account was likely a misunderstanding, an exaggeration, or a projection of Greek anxieties about foreign sexual customs onto a practice that may have been something quite different, or may not have existed in the form he described at all. For Rome specifically, the evidence for temple prostitution is even thinner. What the Roman sources describe is the presence of meretrices in the vicinity of certain temples and certain sacred spaces, which is not quite the same thing. Temples in the ancient city were public spaces. They were also commercial spaces, surrounded by the colonnaded porticos, where merchants, lawyers, and various other traders of goods and services congregated. A meretrix operating in the colonnades near a temple of Venus was not a sacred prostitute in any theological sense. She was a woman doing her work in the most commercially active public space available to her, which happened to be near a temple, because most commercially active public spaces in Rome happened to be near a temple. The distinction matters, not because it changes the circumstances of the women involved in any immediate practical way, but because the myth of sacred prostitution has historically been used to do specific cultural work, to suggest that ancient sexuality was more permissive, more integrated with religious life, more fundamentally different from the post-Christian West than the evidence actually supports. It flattened the actual complexity of ancient women's lives into a fantasy of religious license that served the purposes of the scholars doing the flattening more than it served the historical record. The actual relationship between Roman women in this profession and Roman religious life was more ordinary and more human than the sacred prostitution myth allowed. They went to temples because temples were the centre of civic and spiritual life in Rome, because everyone went to temples, because the need for divine assistance and the comfort of ritual observance did not stop at the boundary of any legal category. They made offerings when they could afford them, and sometimes when they could not quite afford them, because this too is a universal human behaviour, the reaching towards something larger than the immediate circumstances precisely when the immediate circumstances are most difficult. They lit incense. They placed small clay votives at the feet of the goddess. They said whatever it is that people say when they're asking for help from something they cannot see and are not entirely certain is listening. And then they walked back out through the temple portico into the noise and heat of the Roman street, adjusted the drape of the toga that the law required them to wear, and went back to the work that the day still required. The goddess, if she was there, had heard them. The city, as always, was already moving on. She left the room. She left the city eventually when Rome fell and Pompeii was buried, and the empire that had taxed and registered and legally marked her became something that future centuries would call ancient history. What remained was what always remains. The walls with their painted rooms, the scratched names, the price lists, the small clay lamps in the shapes of things that made Roman housewares merchants a reliable living, and the silence around her actual life, the silence that centuries of historians filled with whatever their own era's anxieties required, the degraded victim, the dangerous temptress, the colourful background detail, the cautionary tale, the symbol. She was rarely permitted to be simply a person, a woman waking up in the early light of a loud and smelly and complicated city, putting coal around her eyes and white lead on her face and wondering, as people have always wondered, how the day was going to go. The Renaissance rediscovery of Roman texts brought her back into view in a particular way, filtered through the moralizing commentary of scholars who found her useful as evidence of ancient vice, as a contrast to Christian virtue, as a data point in arguments about the inevitable decline of pagan civilization. She was an argument before she was a person in most of the writing of that period. The actual texture of her daily life, the wool spinning and the bronze mirror and the cold stone floor in the morning, was not what those scholars were interested in. They wanted the category, the symbol, the warning. The person in the category was beside the point. The 18th and 19th centuries produced a different kind of attention. The excavation of Pompeii, beginning in earnest in the 1700s and continuing with increasing systematic rigour through the following century, brought the physical evidence back into the light in ways that forced a reckoning with the actual human scale of the past. The lupanar in Pompeii was excavated and its frescoes documented, and then, in a gesture that is itself a document of its era, the most explicit of the materials were locked in a restricted collection at the Naples National Archaeological Museum called the Secret Cabinet, the Gabinetto Segreto, where they remained accessible only to men of demonstrated scholarly credentials or proven moral robustness for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. The material was real, and the discomfort with it was real, and the solution chosen was to put a door between the two and decide who was allowed to open it. The secret cabinet was open to the general public in 2000. The frescoes, the lamps, the small objects that had been considered too revealing of Roman daily life for ordinary visitors to encounter were simply put on display, as things in museums are put on display, for anyone who bought a ticket and climbed the stairs. They are not shocking seen now. They are informative. They are the evidence of a specific life lived in a specific place at a specific time, documented by the volcanic indifference of a mountain that preserved everything with perfect equality and left the work of interpretation to us. What history eventually did with her memory in the longest view is this: it kept her name, not in the official records which are largely gone, not in the literary sources which used her as furniture for other people's stories, but in the walls, in the graffiti, in the small scratched syllables that a woman or her client pressed into the plaster of a room in a building in a city that was about to stop existing, and which stopped existing in such a specific and total way that everything in it was preserved exactly as it had been left. Fortunata, Restituta, Maria. The names survived the empire that marked them with infamia. They survived the volcano. They survived the centuries of scholars who filled the silence around them with their own preoccupations. They're still there, in the walls of the excavated city, readable by anyone who goes and looks. She was here. She was real. The wall remembers even when everything else has chosen to forget. And now, very gently, so do you. Let's talk about the sources. Because everything we know about the Roman meretrix comes filtered through a specific and remarkably consistent lens. The lens of educated Roman men who had opinions about women in this profession that they were not shy about sharing. Ovid wrote about her. Horace wrote about her. Juvenal wrote about her with the particular energy of a man who found her simultaneously fascinating and disgusting, which is its own form of obsession. Plautus put her on the stage as the Lena, the scheming older woman managing younger ones for profit, a stock character so reliable in Roman comedy that audiences could read her the moment she walked on. The poets, the playwrights, the satirists, the legal commentators, they all had something to say, and what they said, taken together, tells you an enormous amount about the anxieties and assumptions of Roman male culture, and a somewhat more limited amount about the actual lives of the women they were describing. The dominant tone across all these sources is one of knowing irony. The Roman literary tradition prided itself on clear-eyed worldliness, a refusal to be sentimental about the mechanics of urban life, and the meretrix was a reliable vehicle for this pose. She was the one who took your money. She was the one who simulated feeling for commercial purposes. She was the one who made fools of men who mistook the transaction for something more. The satirist's entire job was to unmask the illusion, to show the reader that the apparently warm reception was a calculated performance, that behind the coal-lined eyes and the practiced laugh was nothing but arithmetic. This unmasking was supposed to be a service to the reader. It was supposed to free him from delusion. It very rarely examined whether the satirist's own pose of cynicism was itself a performance, a cultivated attitude that protected him from having to consider the woman as a subject rather than an object of his very clever observations. Ovid, who wrote extensively about the art of love and its practical mechanics, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously playful and deeply Roman in its transactional logic, is perhaps the most interesting of these writers to read carefully. His advice to men about how to manage relationships with women, including women of this profession, is advice premised entirely on the assumption that all parties are performing, that nobody involved is being quite honest, and that the skilled player is the one who manages the performance most effectively. What Ovid does not appear to have considered, or chose not to consider, is that a woman who has learned to perform effectively in circumstances of significant constraint might be doing something more interesting and more difficult than playing a game with him. She might be surviving. The difference between those two things did not appear to interest him. He had poems to write. Juvenal, writing his ferocious satires in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, returned to women of the trade repeatedly and always with the same temperature, hot with contempt, laced with a disgust that the frequency of return makes somewhat difficult to take entirely at face value. A man who finds something truly disgusting tends to look away. Juvenal kept looking and kept writing, which suggests that the disgust was doing some emotional work for him that was more complicated than simple moral disapproval. Reading Juvenal on the subject of Roman women, including meretrices, requires the same skill as reading any highly unreliable narrator, attending not just to what he says, but to what the saying of it reveals about the person who cannot stop saying it. The legal commentators are a different category. Men like Ulpian and Papinian, the great jurists of the classical period, wrote about women in this profession in the specific register of legal definition, precise, careful, concerned with the exact application of categories to situations. They were not performing ironic detachment or moral outrage. They were trying to work out where the lines were. And in working out where the lines were, they preserved an enormous amount of information about how the Roman state understood and managed this corner of its social world. Reading the jurists is like finding the negative space of a life. The shape of the restrictions tells you something about the shape of the existence that the restrictions were designed to contain. What none of them provide, and what reading all of them together still cannot quite provide, is the inside view, the experience from within, the quality of the Tuesday afternoon, the specific weight of the decision made before a specific curtained doorway. The thing she thought when the lamp ran out again, and the oil cost more than it had last week. Those things are not in the sources because the sources were not written by her, for her, or with any particular curiosity about what her version of the story might have been. She was the setting, she was the furniture, she was the example. The idea that she might also have been the narrator of a story worth telling appears to have genuinely not occurred to most of the men who wrote about her. It occurs to us now, somewhat late, but it occurs to us. Rome was not one city. It was dozens of cities stacked inside the same walls, running simultaneously, each neighbourhood with its own texture, its own smells, its own particular combination of people, and trades, and noises, and dangers. The Subura was the neighbourhood that ancient sources most consistently associated with the trade, a dense, loud, multi-storey residential district in the valley, between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, full of apartment buildings called insulae that rose 4 and 5 and 6 stories above the narrow streets, full of the smell of cooking fires and the sound of arguments conducted at full volume between people who lived close enough to touch each other through their windows. The Subura had a reputation in Roman literature as the city's most disreputable neighbourhood, which is the kind of reputation that tends to become self-reinforcing once it is established. You knew the Subura the way you know any neighbourhood you have lived in long enough, not as a literary setting, not as a backdrop, but as a series of specific, textured, daily experiences that your body knew before your mind consciously registered them. The particular angle at which the morning sun came down the street between the buildings and hit the stone of the pavement in the hour after sunrise, when the shadow line retreated and the warmth began to arrive. The sound of the bakery 2 streets over, the low rhythmic thud of dough being worked, the smell of bread that arrived on the air well before the building itself came into view. You knew which stretch of street collected standing water after rain because the paving stones had been laid slightly wrong by someone who had been paid to do it correctly and had not quite managed it, and you knew to take the stepping stones on those mornings or arrive at your destination with wet feet. You knew the faces of the people who were always there. The old man who sat outside the same doorway every morning in the same patch of available sun, moving his chair incrementally as the light shifted through the day, conducting a slow daily negotiation with the shadow that he had been conducting for as long as anyone in the street could remember. The children who ran the same routes between the same buildings, with the specific confidence of children who own the geography they have claimed. The vendor who sold olives and pickled vegetables from a small cart at the corner, his position so consistent and his hours so reliable that he functioned less as a merchant and more as a fixed point around which the neighbourhood organised its sense of itself. You bought from him when you had coins for it, and sometimes when the price of oil had gone up again and the week's arithmetic had come out wrong, you bought nothing, and he understood and neither of you mentioned it, because this too was part of the neighbourhood's unwritten grammar. The insulae, the apartment buildings, were a feature of Roman urban life that shaped daily existence in ways that are simultaneously strange and deeply familiar. They were tall, crowded, structurally unreliable in ways that Roman building regulations attempted to address by setting maximum height limits that builders consistently treated as suggestions rather than requirements. They caught fire, This was not an occasional risk or a theoretical possibility. It was a recurring feature of life in the upper floors of a Roman apartment building, where people cooked on open braziers in rooms built from materials chosen for cost rather than safety, where the water that served the public fountains at street level did not reach, where the distance between a knocked-over lamp and a catastrophe was measured in seconds. The vigils, the night watch, included fire suppression among their responsibilities, but the Subura's density made rapid response difficult, and the results were not always adequate to the scale of the problem. You knew where the nearest exit was. You knew which neighbours were likely to raise the alarm quickly and which ones slept heavily. This was not anxiety. It was simply knowledge, the same category of practical knowledge as which streets were safe after dark and which were not. Moving through the city at night was its own education. The daytime roam of crowds and vendors and noise became a different place after the sun went down, still loud, because the cart traffic that was restricted to nighttime hours filled the streets with the sound of wooden wheels on stone, and the complaints of oxen and the shouts of drivers navigating narrow turns with loads that were never quite the right size for the streets they were being moved through, but loud in a different register, emptier of pedestrians, fuller of shadows between the lamplit doorways, requiring a different quality of attention. You had developed that attention over time. You moved through the nighttime city with a calibrated awareness of someone who had learned its specific grammar through years of necessity, and could read it at a speed that most people who only moved through it occasionally simply could not match. The neighbourhood held everything. The work and the food and the temple and the woman down the street who knew things it had taken you years to learn. You were not passing through it. You were of it, in the specific rooted way of people who have no particular reason to be anywhere else, who have built their entire operational knowledge of the world around the specific geography of these particular streets, this particular corner, this particular angle of morning light on this particular stretch of stone. Rome was enormous and indifferent and magnificent. The Subura was home. History prefers its marginalized figures isolated. It is a cleaner story that way. One woman, her circumstances, her fate, without the complication of the social world she actually inhabited. But the reality of life in a Roman lupanar, or in any establishment where multiple women worked and sometimes lived in close proximity, was a social world of genuine density and complexity. There were other women. There were relationships between them that ran the full range of human social possibility: genuine friendship, practical alliance, rivalry, irritation, the particular intimacy of people who share constrained circumstances and have no one else who fully understands what those circumstances feel like from the inside. The Roman sources characteristically tended to depict relationships between women in this profession in competitive terms, the leaner pitting her charges against each other for the client's attention, the younger woman displacing the older one, the scheming and the calculation and the jealousy that the moralists were convinced defined female relationships in this context, because they were largely convinced, for reasons that had more to do with their own anxieties than with careful observation, that this was how women related to each other generally. Competition as the natural state. Solidarity as an unlikely exception. What they were not particularly interested in recording, and what therefore requires patient reconstruction from the margins of the evidence, is the mutual support that must have been constant, essential, and quietly conducted in the space between the transactions. Consider the practical architecture of what you actually needed in this life that could not be purchased from a stranger or extracted from the Leno with any reliability. You needed someone who would tell you honestly before the day began if the white lead was uneven or the coal had smudged in the night. Not to be kind, though kindness was involved, but because you both understood that the appearance of competence was a working condition and a poorly applied face was a professional liability. You needed someone who could watch a situation that was becoming dangerous and find a reason, any reason, it did not need to be sophisticated to knock on the curtain and interrupt it before it became worse. You needed someone who had encountered the same recurring skin ailment from the same recurring cause and knew which preparation actually helped and which one smelled better than it worked and was not worth the cost. You needed someone who remembered what had happened to the woman before you, who had tried a specific approach with a specific kind of client, so that her experience became your knowledge without requiring you to repeat her particular version of the mistake. This kind of knowledge transfer was, by any reasonable assessment, a matter of physical safety. The difference between knowing and not knowing could be the difference between a manageable evening and a dangerous one, between an illness caught early and one that ran its full course, between a financial arrangement that was merely bad and one that was catastrophic. The women who had been in the building longer than you were not just colleagues in an abstract professional sense. They were the holders of information that you needed to survive the specific conditions of your specific situation, and the sharing of that information was an act of solidarity that left almost no written record and must have happened every single day. The evenings had their own quality. When the work slowed and the lamp oil burned lower, and the city outside settled into its nighttime rhythms, there was time and sometimes space for something other than the transactional and the vigilant. Music moved through the building. Conversation moved through it. The specific laughter that is only possible between people who share a reference point that nobody outside the building would quite understand, the laughter that does not need explanation, because the person laughing beside you was there when it happened and remembers exactly how it felt. These moments are not in the historical record. They were never written down, but they happened because human beings in shared difficult circumstances consistently produce them, as reliably as bread rises and water flows downhill, as reliably as any physical law. The rivalries were also real, and it would be false comfort to pretend otherwise. In a world where income depended on being chosen, the other women in the building were also competitors, and competition in conditions of scarcity has a specific sharpness that more comfortable arrangements do not produce. Small conflicts over space, over the allocation of the limited resources the building contained, over clients who had a preference and whose preference was a form of income, these were regular features of daily life, managed or mismanaged by the Leno with varying degrees of skill and fairness, and sometimes simply not managed at all, and left to resolve themselves in the way that unmanaged conflicts between people in close quarters tend to resolve themselves, which is to say, imperfectly, slowly, and with residual effects that last longer than anyone would prefer. And yet, you had people. They were real and complicated and sometimes difficult and occasionally, in the specific way that matters most, genuinely there. History prefers its marginalized figures isolated, as we have said. But she was not isolated. She was surrounded in the small stone building by the sound of other breathing, other movement, other lives conducted alongside hers in the particular compressed proximity of shared circumstances. She was not alone in the room. She was almost never alone in the room. That is not nothing. In a city of 1 million people, inside a legal system designed to render you invisible, to have someone in the room who actually sees you is, in the quietest and most fundamental sense, everything. And so, here we are, at the end of a very long day in ancient Rome. You have woken up on a cold stone floor before the city gave you permission to. You have applied white lead to your face with the resigned efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. You have eaten your porridge and your bread and your olive oil and tried not to think too hard about what was in the water. You have walked to work through a neighbourhood that smelled of bread and fish sauce and everything in between, wearing a garment the law required you to wear so that anyone who looked at you would know, immediately and without ambiguity, exactly what category you'd been assigned to. You have sat in a small stone room with a curtain for a door and a lamp that ran out at inconvenient moments, and a price written on the wall beside your name that the state had decided to record with the same bureaucratic thoroughness it applied to grain shipments and military rosters. You have navigated a Leno's arithmetic. You have managed a legal system that marked you with infamia and then spent centuries arguing about what exactly that meant in practice. You have put your savings in rings on your fingers because rings are harder to take than coins in a box. You have gone to the temple and lit the incense and said what needed saying to whatever was listening, and then walked home through the noise and heat of the most powerful city in the world, carrying everything quietly, the way people carry things when there is no one official enough to carry them for you. And through all of it, through the registered price and the required toga and the legal commentary and the satirists and the centuries of historians who filled the silence around you with whatever their own era needed you to be, through all of it, you remained stubbornly, specifically, undeniably a person with a morning routine and a favourite corner of the neighbourhood, and a woman 2 doors down who knew things worth knowing and told you some of them. A person who spun wool in the quiet hours because it gave the hands something to do while the mind went somewhere else. A person whose name, scratched into the plaster of a wall in a city that stopped existing in a single afternoon, is still there, still readable, still real. Fortunata, Restituta, Maria. They survived the empire. They survived the volcano. They survived 2,000 years of people who preferred the symbol to the person. And tonight, in this quiet room, wherever you are listening from, they have survived one more night. Because you sat with their story. Because you let it be as complicated and as ordinary and as fully human as it actually was, rather than the cautionary tale or the colourful footnote that history more often makes of people it does not quite know what to do with. So tonight, as you pull the blanket a little closer and let the day drain out of you, maybe take a quiet moment to be grateful. Grateful for the bed that does not have a stone platform underneath it. Grateful for the skincare routine that does not involve lead. Grateful for the fact that your legal status is not written on your clothing, that you can walk through your neighbourhood without announcing your category to every person you pass, that the morning ahead of you contains choices that the woman in that small Roman room did not have, and spent her whole life working around anyway, with a resourcefulness that the historical record, despite its best efforts to overlook her, cannot entirely conceal. History is full of people who were never meant to be remembered, people who lived in the margins of official documents and the cracks between literary sources, whose names survived only because a stranger scratched them into a wall before a mountain ended an ordinary afternoon. They were not heroes in the way that history usually uses the word. They did not lead armies or write philosophies or build monuments. They woke up early on cold mornings and put their faces on and went to work and came home and did it again and again and again, in a city that was magnificent and indifferent and completely real. That is its own kind of endurance, its own kind of defiance, its own kind of legacy, quieter than marble and more durable than most things that get called permanent. She was here. She was entirely, completely, undeniably here. And now in this room, in whatever city you're in, at whatever hour it happens to be, so are you. Warm, safe, with clean water and a soft bed and the long, easy dark of a night that asks nothing of you except rest. Let it have you. Good night.